We want to give Amy our Pathmaker for Peace Award tonight for her courage, for her dedication to the causes that we all believe in, and for being the single media person who has really led the way in making sure that the variety of news in the world is conveyed to us in a way that is intelligent, intelligible, and is unbiased, at least as compared to, say, the New York Times, without fear or favor. So with that, let me bring up Amy Goodman.
Wow, what an honor it is to be here with all of you tonight. Brooklyn for peace. It is so much harder to wage peace than it is to wage war. And we have to change that. I want to also acknowledge my colleague at Democracy Now!, Malik Nickens, who is here with me tonight. We're very excited at Democracy Now! Because in a few months, in February, we turned 20. We began in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We thought we would last for 9 months, covering the primaries and then leading up to the election. When I was called to to host the show, I was in an underground house in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. They said, would I be interested in doing this daily election show, the only one in public broadcasting? And, you know, in Haiti, they would be gunned down when they went to the polls, and they still did. And the vast majority of people voted. In the United States, most people did not vote. And I thought, well, doing an election show, I mean, in places like East Timor, the same, people would be carried out in stretchers to cast their last vote before they died. But in the United States, when we face nothing like this kind of adversity, people didn't vote. But then I thought, you know, there are people like you and not like you all over the country who are deeply engaged in their communities, and that is the majority of people in the United States. And if they weren't voting, what were they doing? What a way to go around the country and see how people were engaged. What were they doing? And that's how we started, giving a voice to the grassroots. And when the election wrapped up, that year it was President Bill Clinton who won. We thought that Democracy Now! Would wind up as well. But there was more demand for the show after the elections than before, because of that focus on people on the ground in every community and what you're doing. So we went from 8 community radio stations in 1996, maybe it was 9, and then 1997, we dared to broadcast the voice of Mumia Abu-Jamal. One of the stations, it was actually a network run by Temple University, Jazz FM, broadcast Democracy Now! All through the state of Pennsylvania. But when we dared to air his voice, which we did not think should have been that daring, he had recorded a collection of commentaries. He'd actually done it first for National Public Radio, and the editor who did it said, these are some of the finest commentaries on any issue we've ever heard. But then the Fraternal Order of Police put enormous pressure on NPR, and they locked the commentaries away in a safe and decided, though giving them tremendous publicity that they were going to do this, decided in the end they wouldn't. And we felt it was absolutely critical to do this. He didn't talk about his own case, and we did invite the Fraternal Order of Police on, but he talked about father hunger in prison, what it means for so many young men to not have a father figure. He talked about capital punishment as punishment for those without capital, and many other issues. So the first day that we were airing the commentaries, we had the Society of Professional Journalists on with us. They thought it was extremely important. We're not there to win a popularity contest. There's a reason why our profession is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. It's our job to go to where the silence is. And when you have a country like the United States with 5% of the population, but 25% of the prisoners, it's our job to put those microphones between the bars and get the voices of those inside. So many people unjustly held there. And so we stood our ground, and we lost one of our community radio networks. So we went down instead of up in terms of the number of stations we were on. But students protested at Temple University. The university put out that day, as we were broadcasting, they took us off the air mid-show and started playing music. They said that the demand of the listeners was for more jazz. I felt very bad as a jazz lover that was the excuse that was used. And the Society of Professional Journalists was shocked this was happening. The problem for Jazz FM was that they had already sent out their folio, and it had said that Democracy Now! Was their most successful show, and they were using it as a model for their other programs. But there we were, off the air. So Temple University Law School held a forum. It was packed. But ultimately, they stuck by their decision, and Democracy Now! Grew by leaps and bounds all over the country. Station by station picked us up. And now, almost 20 years later, and then in 2001, actually, the week of September 11th, coincidentally, we went on to our first television station. It was Manhattan Neighborhood Network, had planned before September 11th that we should broadcast on air. And then because it was September 11th, that fateful day, we began on Manhattan Neighborhood Network as emergency broadcasting, picked up then by Brooklyn Cable Access and stations all over the country. TV stations started to ask for Democracy Now! Soon the FedEx and mailmen came, and we had bags, garbage bags filled with video cassettes at the time, and they would pick them up and send them out around the country as stations asked for Democracy Now! And now, almost 20 years later, we're broadcasting on close to 1,400 public radio and television stations around the country and around the world. And it's a testament to the hunger for authentic voices, showing the reality on the ground in this country and around the world, connecting the dots of our experience. We are not that different from the people of Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from South Africa. We are not that different from communities all over this country, as is remarkably evidenced in these last few days when you see one campus, University of Missouri, students standing up, begun by one student, Jonathan Butler, who said, "I'm not just going to sit by and take the racial insensitivity, the lack of regard for students of color at this university, although the university makes so much money off of us. You think about the football team, the coach makes $4 million a year. The black students at University of Missouri make up something like 7% of the population of the 35,000 students, but the football team something like 69%. And when Jonathan went on a hunger strike, and that inspired the black players on the football team, when they said, no, if he's going to stop eating, we can certainly walk outside and support him. That led the white players to support the black players, the coaches to support the whole team when they said, we're not going to play ball anymore. And that has now led to the ouster of the president and the chancellor, the naming of a new president, one of the first African-American presidents of the University of Missouri, just named today. And it ignited Yale University, where they just had a march of resilience a few nights ago of 1,000 students in support of University of Missouri, but raising questions about their own campus, which led Smith to protest, Columbia, and now Ithaca College. Tune in to Democracy Now! Tomorrow when you hear Wole Soyinka's daughter, who is a longtime professor at Ithaca College, as well as students, talking about their demands for their own president to leave, their demands that the university change and start respecting students of color. You know, blacks on campus is trending everywhere. And a young alum who participated in a planning session for Ithaca College just a few weeks ago, a young African-American woman with two older white alums, sat down together to talk about the future of their school. And she said, "We feel a savage hunger, a savage hunger." And the billionaire financier, who is an alum, sitting with her in conversation with Bob Kerr, who is at CBS and also an alum who is leading the conversation, the hedge fund financier said, "Well, this savage over here," and Bob Kerr said, "And now let's talk, you know, as we have this wonderful conversation with the savage and with our other guests." And she's saying, "What?" And the financier put his hand on her and said, "No, I think you're really exceptional when I say savage." And this was not the only thing that ignited this campus, but it fueled the protests and the demands that are happening today. Movements are what make all of the difference. And how important it is, as we broadcast the Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report every day, to take on war, the backdrop of everything that is happening, these endless wars that are being waged. No one disputes that the United States military attacked a hospital in the city of Kunduz, Afghanistan, in the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, October 3rd. The airstrike on Doctors Without Borders facility, the Kunduz Trauma Center, was devastating, with at least 30 people killed. They haven't been able to identify all of the remains, so they're not sure of the number. Patients in the only intensive care unit in the region were burned to death in their beds. Medical staffers were killed by shrapnel bombs that tore off their limbs. At least one person was decapitated. Are we talking about ISIS? Are we talking about the Taliban? No. As the people fled the burning building, the U.S. AC-130 gunship slaughtered them from above with automatic fire. Doctors and other medical staff were shot while running to reach safety in a different part of the compound. The Kunduz Trauma Center had been in the same place, performing thousands of surgeries and treating tens of thousands of people in the emergency room for 4 years. Doctors Without Borders, known internationally by its French name, Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, had repeatedly provided the exact GPS coordinates of the hospital complex to U.S. and Afghan government officials. We had Jason Cohn on Democracy Now!, the executive director of Doctors Without Borders USA. He said, as a precondition of opening the hospital, we negotiated with the U.S., with Afghan, with NATO, and opposition forces, with the Taliban. We received the support of all of those groups to operate in the hospital, he said. Part of that was sharing our GPS coordinates with the various parties. We shared them as recently as September 29th. This was October 3rd. When I asked Jason Cohn, as he sat at Democracy Now!, if this constituted a war crime, he employed the precise language of the humanitarian aid worker. He said, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not this was a mistake. This is not necessarily the threshold that has to be crossed for this to constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian law. If the military fails to distinguish between military and civilian targets, as is in this case, from our standpoint, from everything we know, then they are guilty, he said. MSF is demanding an independent investigation And that demand is being supported by now well over 500,000 signatures. Not the US alone to investigate, not NATO, not the Afghan government, but a truly independent investigation. 3 weeks after the attack in Kunduz, another MSF hospital was struck, this time in Yemen. The hospital was hit multiple times over a 2-year period last week, even though the roof was marked with the MSF logo and its GPS coordinates have been shared multiple times with the Saudi-led coalition forces. Every indication is that the Saudi Arabian military, using US-provided bombers and arms, launched the strike. The horror of the Kunduz hospital attack will never leave MSF nurse Laho Sultan Jeks. She was sleeping in the hospital safe room when the bombs hit. It was like 2, 3 in the morning. She said, "We tried to take a look into one of the burned buildings. I cannot describe what was inside. There are no words for how terrible it was. It was in the intensive care unit, 6 patients burning in their beds. We saw our colleagues dying, our pharmacist. I was just talking to him last night and planning the stocks, and then he died there in our office," she said. Neither hospital attack has been mentioned in any of the US presidential debates or forums so far. We need a full investigation of these crimes to hold those responsible accountable, and we need a full debate in this presidential year to determine whether attacks like these that only perpetuate terror will be allowed to continue. And so in this period, in this last week, an unprecedented joint plea was issued by the Secretary General of the United Nations and the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. An unprecedented joint warning for states to end wars, respect international law, and aid the 60 million refugees made homeless from recent conflicts. There's a discussion in the United States, should we be so compassionate as to let some refugees in, because it's only the humanitarian thing to do. But it's not just a matter of being innocent bystanders here, where we should open our doors to people in pain. When you bomb the cradle of civilization back to the cradle, these are the consequences. It's people directly hit, killed, maimed, and it's the people who are fleeing the carnage, millions of them. It's not a matter of whether we should be generous. It's a matter of a responsibility we bear in understanding the full effects of war. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said in this unprecedented joint warning, "The continuing violence is a clear indication that a political solution to the conflict in Syria is desperately needed. The fighting must stop now. There's no military solution to the crisis, not in Syria or anywhere else. From Afghanistan to the Central African Republic, from Ukraine to Yemen, combatants and those who control them are defying humanity's most basic rules." And the head of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, President Peter Maurer, added, "When humanitarian law and principles are disregarded, when humanitarian needs are trumped by political agendas, when access to the wounded and sick is denied, and when security concerns lead to a suspension of operations, people are abandoned, the notion of protection loses its meaning, and humanity is flouted. We ask that states reaffirm our shared humanity by concrete action and uphold their responsibility to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law." And I go back to those painful moments after 9/11, this horror that we all experienced. I bet a number of you lost dear ones at the World Trade Center. 3,000 people incinerated in a moment. We'll never actually know how many people died on that day, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death, the undocumented people who may have lived or worked in this area. It was horrific, but it wasn't the first time terror came to U.S. soil. Ask any African American about slavery, ask any Native American about what took place, but it was horrific. It was not the only time that terror was connected to the date September 11th. You know, we were the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero, September 11th. We were broadcasting from downtown community television, a wonderful community media center in an old firehouse just blocks from Ground Zero. We broadcast at the time at 9. Now we broadcast at 8 each morning. The first plane hit at 8:47, the second at 9:03. We were preparing our show, didn't know what had happened. We were in the attic of this old firehouse. We were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th. 1973, the day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile as the Pinochet forces, sadly, the US-backed Pinochet forces, the Nixon-backed, the ITT-backed Pinochet forces rose to power and ruled that country for 17 years, killing so many thousands of Chileans and beyond that, Latin Americans. No, it wasn't the only time September 11th was connected to terror. Look at Guatemala. Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack died at the hands of Guatemalan security forces September 11th, 1990, on sadly US-backed Guatemalan military forces. September 11th, 1977, Steve Biko, founder of the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa, was being beaten to death in the back of a van by apartheid forces, sadly US-backed apartheid forces. He died in the early morning hours of December 12th, 1977. September 11th, 1971, Attica. September 9th to September 13th, 1971. Prisoners rose up to protest prison conditions, and Governor Nelson Rockefeller called out the state troopers on September 13th, and they opened fire, killing 39 men, prisoners and guards, critically wounding scores of others and injuring hundreds of others. It's not the first time we connect September 11th with terror, but September 11th, 2001 was something we will all never forget. We stayed in the firehouse. We knew we needed to keep broadcasting. We heard the kind of battle cry that was emanating from the rest of the networks, and we saw very quickly that was not the feeling of people on the ground, the emergency workers that were coming, they hoped to save people, the people who streamed into parks with their candles, the images of the people, Xerox photographs on every telephone pole, on every park bench. Have you seen my mother? A picture of a woman, last seen, it would say, running from Tower 1, or have you seen my son, last seen in Tower 2. Those images connected us with people all over the world who suffer from terror, like the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, who walked the Plaza de Mayo. Have you seen my son? Have you seen my granddaughter? Yes, September 11th united us with people all over, saying we need a universal standard of justice that we all must abide by. That would make us the greatest power on earth, to pave the way, to lead the way for justice and equality around the world. What gives us hope now, 14 years later? What gives us hope? It's the movements. You know, this week, 20 years ago, November 10th, 1995, Ken Saro-Wiwa, the great Nigerian activist, writer, Ogoni leader, was executed by the Nigerian government with 8 other human rights activists. Ken and I met in New York at WBAI. Bernard and I were doing Wake Up Call together. And a Nigerian activist walked in and said, I have Ken Saro-Wiwa here and we'd like to do the interview. And we said, what interview? We don't know who this is. I'm ashamed to say I said this. This was at the end of 1994. And he said, we've got Ken Saro-Wiwa. And I said, well, I'm sorry, the show is totally booked. We're on the show, totally overbooked. But if you could come back maybe tomorrow, we could work out saying, no, he only has today. And so we said 2 minutes. So we brought this gentleman on the air. And he said, I am a marked man. He'd come from Nigeria to talk about what's happening in the Niger Delta, in his community, Ogoni land, where Shell Corporation crisscrossed the land with oil pipelines, flares the size of apartment buildings, that's gas being burned off in massive flares, lit the night sky. Children never knew a dark night as they inhaled the ash day and night of this huge multinational corporation. And Ken, one of the most famous writers of the national soap opera in Nigeria, threw in his lot with the Ogoni people, his people, and said, I will fight for our community. And he traveled the world letting people know what was happening, talking about the nexus of power when you have dictators who are shored up by world powers like the United States and multinational corporations like Shell and Chevron. And he said, I am a marked man. When I go back to Nigeria, I will be arrested. One by one, we were dismissing the guests who were next, and we kept Ken on for the whole broadcast. He did go back to Nigeria. He was arrested with 8 others in a sham trial that Shell sat in all the time, even went to Ken's brother, Dr. Owens-Wiwa, and said, if Ken will call off the international protests as people would cut up their Shell credit cards, maybe we could get him out. And Dr. Owens-Wiwa said, that is way beyond Ken's control. That is a people's movement that has risen up. But if you have that power, you should do it now. Only you, he said, can stop the protests by stopping your behavior, exploiting the people of the Niger Delta. Ken went through a sham trial with his other activist colleagues. And when years later, my colleague Jeremy Scahill and I went to the Niger Delta, to Ogoni land, to meet Ken's family, we were met by the whole community in Ogoni land. And one man came forward and read Ken's last statement in his trial before November 10th, 1995. They were all executed. He said, my Lord, we all stand before history. I am a man of peace, of ideas, appalled by the denigrating poverty of my people who live on a richly endowed land, distressed by their political marginalization and economic strangulation, angered by the devastation of their land, their ultimate heritage, anxious to preserve their right to life and to a decent living, and determined to usher to this country as a whole a fair and just democratic system which protects everyone and every ethnic group and gives us all a valid claim to human civilization. I have devoted my intellectual and material resources, my very life, to a cause in which I have total belief and from which I cannot be blackmailed or intimidated. I have no doubt at all about the ultimate success of my cause, no matter the trials and tribulations which I and those who believe with me may encounter on our journey. Neither imprisonment nor death can stop our ultimate victory, he said. With that, he was found guilty with his colleagues, and the Nigerian military dictatorship executed him. But the movement has not died, and the connection between the most disempowered communities providing power, oil, to the most powerful countries on earth, and sadly, the cause of so much of the strife and warfare that we are experiencing today. As the joke goes, in Iraq, one American little boy turned to his father and said, "What's our oil doing under their sand?" The hope is what Ken sparked and what young people and old today are fighting for: a sustainable planet that we all must steward. Democracy Now! Goes to the UN climate summits every year, from Copenhagen to Cancun, from Doha to Durban, from Warsaw to Lima, and this year we'll be in Paris for 2 weeks. Tune in for the entire 2 weeks. We're the only national broadcast that spends every hour of our show for the entire summit broadcasting. You might say, why do we waste the fuel in going to these places? What actually takes place? A fair question. Our focus is not so much inside. It's what happens outside. Thousands of people from all over the globe come. The movement against climate change and for sustainability is so much more advanced outside of the United States. And to reflect those voices back to the United States is so important. As we did in Durban just a few years ago. It was 2011. Anjali Appadurai, she was a student at the time at the College of the Atlantic, a school I visited up in Maine, where you get a degree in human ecology and the interconnection of human beings in their environment. She and a bunch of other colleagues, students from not only the United States, but around the world, came together in Durban, and she was actually invited into the summit to address the body at the end. The spokesperson, the chairperson of the UN Climate Summit in Durban said, "It's now I give the floor to Ms. Anjali Appadurai from College of the Atlantic, who will speak on behalf of youth non-governmental organizations." Ms. Appadurai, you have the floor. Anjali stood up. She said, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money. You've been negotiating all of my life. In that time, you've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises. But you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front lines of climate change. But as 2012 dawns, our Green Climate Fund remains empty. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid inevitable climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. She said, "Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion." There is real ambition in this room, she said, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. She concluded by saying, "Respect the integral values of humanity. Respect the future of your descendants." Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." So distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. With that, she came off the stage, did a mic check with all the students in the room, and they marched out. And it was astounding. And the chairperson turned and said, "You know, I was just thinking. Thank you, Ms. Apadarai, who was speaking on behalf of half the world's population. I think she said at the beginning, and on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, not last. So things were looking up. And the next year I saw Anjali, and she came on the broadcast, and I said, so how are you participating in this conference? She said, oh, I'm not. I was banned. But 2015, this year, is so important. And it's the culmination of the work of people like Anjali and thousands of people all over the planet. Mohammed Nasheed, a spokesperson for sustainability, who's the president, right, who was the president of the Maldives, is now in jail, I do believe, for his global activism. The price people have paid, not to mention the prices all of us will pay. Climate refugees and the threats they pose. Look at the Pentagon reports. They are the ones who know that climate change is the deepest threat to national security in the 21st century. And only together can we make a difference on this issue. And what gives us hope are the movements, like the students at the University of Missouri, at Ithaca College, at Yale, at Columbia, all over this country, who recognize that they do have the power if they stand together. When you think about the year that Anjali spoke, when she said, this is the year that the bottom rocked the top, she was talking 2011. Think about what happened in that year. It started at the end of 2010, right? It was Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, who was so sick and tired of being harassed by authorities as he had no opportunity to advance but sold fruits and vegetables in the marketplace. And then the authorities actually took his scale, and he couldn't even do that anymore. He got so frustrated, he set himself on fire. And that ignited the Tunisian revolution that toppled their long-standing dictator, Ben Ali. Oh, something else did as well. WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks released documents that showed the U.S. relationship with these dictators. It's not as if they didn't know that their leader was a dictator. But what they saw, and it's not as if they didn't know the U.S. was supporting him to the tune of millions of dollars. What they saw is the U.S. fully understood what they were doing in these documents. But it was the people on the ground who said, we're going to change this. And that ignited then the Egyptian revolution, and we will see where that goes. A revolution that continues to unfold. And that crossed the Atlantic, and it ignited hope all over the United States. Think about Wisconsin in that cold summer, that cold winter of 2011. Truly astounding. When Democracy Now! Flew in, we found 150,000 people taking over the Capitol building, taking on their governor, Scott Walker, who is trying to eviscerate union rights. He was careful. He was separating the unions. He told the police and the firefighters, I'm not going after you. It's the teachers and the nurses that we're going to get. So when we got to the Capitol, it was amazing. I saw some of the biggest guys I had ever seen. They were the Oshkosh prison guards, tattooed all over. And I went up to them and I said, who did you vote for governor? And they said, Governor Walker, of course. So I said, so what are you doing here in the Capitol? Protesting Governor Walker, of course. And when I asked the police and the firefighters who were sleeping next to the nurses and the teachers occupying the Capitol, why they were there, they said, yeah, he tells us he's not going after us, but aside from being married to these other people, we know that we will be next. I mean, the scenes in front of Scott Walker's office with the kids with dreads down to their waist, drumming away, and the police rocking out next to them, I've never seen anything like this. Outside in the freezing cold, I saw an older gentleman, white hair, glasses, with a sign, IRS auditors against Walker. I said, are you a Republican or a Democrat? A Republican, of course. Who did you vote for? Yes, Governor Walker, of course. Then why are you out here walking? He said, because he never told us that he was going to destroy our community. It was people across the political spectrum who were united because they understood the reality on the ground. And I looked across this vast sea. They had not seen anything like this in Wisconsin history, sea of people. There was the Labor Museum across the grounds of the Capitol. You know, Wisconsin, 1932, was the home, the founding birthplace of AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. I know I don't have to tell you guys. But it was also the place where the John Birch Society would thrive, co-founded by Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers. And if you wonder, well, you know, Governor Walker was reelected. He ran for president, but then that didn't go too far. But he was reelected. What difference did all this protest make? As I looked across at that Labor Museum, you think about the power of movements. They don't happen all at once. I mean, AFSCME was born in Wisconsin, and Dr. Martin Luther King went to Memphis in that fateful period, April 4th, 1968, when he was gunned down. He simply went to march with a AFSCME local, sanitation workers organizing their local, to show the power of what it means and how important unions are, people working together are. And the people in the Capitol were getting pizza orders sent in, not that they had ordered, but that Egyptians had ordered online for the people of Wisconsin. And then you make your way through this period to the summer of 2011. Thousands of people encircled the White House. 1,200 of them got arrested, protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. This was the summer of 2011. Among those people arrested, Naomi Klein, who wrote The Shock Doctrine and This Changes Everything, Bill McKibben, the co-founder of 350.org. First Nations in Canada and Indigenous people in this country led this movement. Would it make a difference? Hillary Clinton was saying she thought it was a good idea at the time. This shows the power of movements, because she has come out against the Keystone XL now, just before the final death knell for one of the dirtiest ways to supply power to any country. It wasn't for our country, of course, you understand. The tar sands were being dug up, drilled in Canada, and the pipeline would go across the United States down to the Gulf, and the oil would be exported. Who would have thought 4 years later that TransCanada would be asking to delay, suspend their application, and the Obama administration would finally say, not only can you not suspend your application, but we're killing it today, in order to save the planet. These connections between oil and war on one side, and sustainability, justice, challenging inequality. My colleague Dennis Moynihan and I write a column every week, and we put it together in a book called The Silenced Majority. And the reason we call it The Silenced Majority is because I really do think those who care about war and peace, those who care about the unprecedented inequality that is only growing in this country, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. You know what is reflected on the networks. Just recently, one of the debates, Wolf Blitzer was moving back into the debate, and he was saying, we're going to hear whether people are for boots on the ground or just bombing by air. That is the range of opinion expressed. Boots on the ground, or do you bomb by air? What about if war were not an option? What would we do? And that's where we have to start. And that's where I think these movements in this country that are led by young people, that's where the hope is. They see things very clearly and broadly. But I wanted to end tonight, November 12th, back 24 years ago, because it was November 12th, 1991, that in a tiny country across the world, East Timor, the people of East Timor understood the power of the most powerful countries, sadly, on the other end of a US-made weapon. I wouldn't have even raised it tonight, but it is the anniversary, and I can't let it go past without honoring the hundreds of people who were gunned down on this day 24 years ago. You all know the story because there's a Pacifica radio, because there is a network that is not brought to you by the oil or gas or coal companies when we talk about climate change. That's not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers when we talk about war and peace. That's not brought to you by the insurance industry or big pharma when we talk about healthcare. No, you have a network in this country, and in New York, you've got WBAI that is so important and must be preserved because it's brought to you by listeners like you and not like you, who are deeply committed to getting independent information. Independent media is the oxygen of a democracy. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day, war and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they kill or are killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. But East Timor. In 1975, President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger went to Indonesia, met with a long-reigning dictator who had presided over the killing of perhaps more than 1 million of his own people within the last years. But in 1965 to 67. In 75, Kissinger and Ford met with Suharto and gave him the go-ahead for Indonesia to invade this tiny island country, East Timor, about 300 miles above Australia. As the President and Secretary of State flew out to then go meet with Marcos in the Philippines, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor by land, by air, and by sea. And they closed East Timor to the outside world starting on December 7th, 1975. And they commenced one of the great slaughters of the 20th century. I got a chance to go to Timor in 1990 and 91 with my colleague, an incredibly brave journalist named Alan Nairn. He was writing for The New Yorker. I was doing a documentary for Pacifica, and we went after 17 years of this occupation. We heard that 1/3 of the population had been killed. We found there a hell on earth. Everywhere we went, the military was surveilling the people, taking the people, ripping them out of their homes. It was truly terrifying. And we went in 1990 and then back in 1991. It was the end of October, and the reason we went then, this was 24 years ago, was because we heard for the first time ever the UN had brokered a deal with Indonesia that they could send in a delegation to investigate the human rights situation. We wanted to go to see how the Timorese were going to be able to talk to this UN delegation. When we got there, we went to the main church in Dili, the capital of Timor. The women were crying in the mass. We didn't know if it was the standard sorrow of this occupied country or if something terrible had just happened. And we learned after the mass that the Indonesian military had surrounded the church the night before and shot into it and killed a young man who had taken refuge in the church. So many young people had taken refuge in the churches of East Timor to prepare to speak to the delegation. They didn't want to be arrested, and the church, the Catholic Church, was the only place that they could take refuge. They left their workplaces, their homes, and they were all hiding out in these churches, and the military had come to the main church and shot into it and killed this young man named Sebastião Gomez. The next day, there was a funeral for him, and 1,000 people came out. And they went to the cemetery following the procession, the funeral procession, and we'd never seen anything like it. The the people of East Timor put up their hands in the V sign, and they shouted, "Viva East Timor, Viva Independence, Viva Sebastião," not that they knew him. And in this unprecedented act of defiance, they buried Sebastião. Well, we were waiting for the UN delegation. And in this 2-week period, we learned that the UN would not be coming. The delegation was not coming. We later learned it was at the behest of the United States. So then came November 12th, 1991. And the young people decided they wanted to march once again on the 2-week anniversary of Sebastião's death to the cemetery to retrace their steps. It was early in the morning. We went to the church where the Mass was held. The priests, so many people in the church, they had to hold the communion outside, and now thousands came. And after Mass, they went out into the street, and this time they unfurled banners from their Catholic school uniforms. They would rip out bed sheets they had hidden. And you'd see a young woman with her traditional an older woman in her traditional Timorese garb holding up one end of a sign, and a girl in her Catholic school uniform holding out the other. And they marched through the streets of Dili, through this geography of pain, where every other building they passed, perhaps it was a military barracks where prisoners were killed, or in the back of a hotel where Timorese were held, or officers' homes where Timorese women were raped. They knew this place so well. It was their home, but it was occupied. And they marched through the streets of Dili, and they made their way to the cemetery, the same place where Sebastião was buried. Thousands of people marched, and we followed them. And at the cemetery, we asked them, it was about 8 in the morning, "Why are you doing this?" The Indonesian military had lined the route. They were risking so much. And the people said, "For my mother," or "For my father, for my village." It was wiped out. And then from the direction the procession had come, we saw hundreds of Indonesian soldiers marching down the dirt road, holding their USM-16s at the ready position. We were in the middle of the crowd interviewing people. Alan suggested we walk to the front because although we knew they had committed many massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. And so we thought if we made clear who we were, we always hid who we were because we didn't want to endanger any person speaking to a Western journalist. But now we thought, we took out our equipment. I put my headphones on. I held up my microphone like a flag. Alan put the camera above his head, and we walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up 10 to 12 abreast. The people were trapped because there were high walls on either side of the road. People at the back could run away. Some could run through a tiny wall in the cemetery. And the soldiers marched up. It was very quiet. Behind us, the people stood. We saw the soldiers marching up. I had my microphone out like a flag, and the soldiers swept around the corner, and without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation, they swept past us, and they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down was a little boy behind us. He just exploded from the gunfire, and the soldiers kept shooting. A group of them came at me, and they took my microphone, waving it in my face as if to say, "This is what we don't want." And they slammed me to the ground. Alan took a photograph of the soldiers opening fire, and he threw himself on top of me to protect me. But then they took their USM-16s like baseball bats and slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we were laying on the ground. Alan was covered in blood. They were killing everyone around us. And they lined up in firing squad fashion, a group of them that weren't killing the others, and they put the guns to our heads. They'd stripped us now of everything. And the only thing I had left was my passport. And they were shouting, Australia, Australia, and they were shouting politique, politique, as if to say we were political if we were doing this, and were we from Australia? So I threw my passport at them. You know, we were from America, and we said, no, America, America. They'd kick me in the stomach, I'd get my breath back, America, America. More joined in this firing squad line, but ultimately they took the guns from our heads. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never had to pay for killing the Timorese, and they moved on. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up, and the driver got out, and they had beaten an old Timorese man into a ditch, and every time he picked up his hand in prayer, they took the butts of their rifles and they smashed his face. And they had moved on to kill others, and the Red Cross driver picked him up and put him in the Jeep. We climbed into the Jeep. Scores of Timorese jumped on top of us, on top of the vehicle, and we drove away from this killing field to the hospital, where the doctors and nurses were furiously working on people to save them, those who had not died right there being shot. Incredibly brave young people who could have run. But when one of their friends or sisters or brothers had fallen, they would stop and hold them so they wouldn't die alone, and then they would be shot. And so these were the people in this hospital. But when the doctors and nurses saw us, they started to cry. And I think not because we were in worse shape than the Timorese, we weren't, but what we represent to people, not me and Alan, I'm talking about all of us as Americans, as Westerners, and not just to people in Timor, but all over the world. They see us in two ways, as the sword and the shield. The sword because the U.S. provides weapons to human rights abusing regimes like the Indonesian government. But they also see the people in a different way than their government. And they see the people of the United States as their shield. And that day they saw their shield bloodied, and I think it just deepened their despair. We went into hiding then. We knew we had to leave the hospital. The military would raid it very soon. This is where the survivors were. We got to the bishop's house, Bishop Bello, Bishop Carlos Jimenez Bello, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize with José Ramos Horta, who would become president. But we went to his house, and thousands were taking refuge at the bishop's house. We knew the only way, we certainly had not succeeded in stopping the killing. The Indonesian military killed 270 people on that day. And this was not one of the larger massacres in Timor. But we knew the only way we could stop the killing is if we got out, got word to the outside world. There was one plane getting out that day. The bishop helped me clean up Alan. He gave him his shirt. Alan's head was just glistening with blood under his hair. But if we could clean it up fast enough and get to the airport, maybe we could get out on the plane without the military noticing. The city was now shut down. We raced to the airport, and at the airport, the security run by the military started to shout and deal with us. And we didn't know if they didn't realize we were at the massacre site or they had officially decided not to kill us, so now they wanted us out. But we did get out of the country, got on that plane, made our way to West Timor, which is part of Indonesia, and on to Bali, where we could make the phone call to the West. And as Alan made that call, I took the towel. We couldn't go back to get any of our things, but I had taken his bloody shirt and wrapped it under a towel around my skirt because I thought, I knew the military would deny anything had taken place, but how could they explain what happened to us? And someone had taken 18 pictures of us just so that we could show that when we got out, and I hid that. And when we got to Bali, we made the call. Alan called, and I was wiping the phone, the blood off of the phone as he spoke, and he said, there's been this massacre. We flew on to Guam. In Guam, we went to the cable network station that linked up with CNN, showed the photographs, explained what had happened. The Indonesian military denied anything had happened, as they so often had. This was November 12th, 1991. We got back to the United States as Alan was operated on in Guam and in Washington, D.C. We then held a news conference at the National Press Club to ensure that people understood That what allowed the Indonesian military to do that was our weapons. From the beginning in 1975, the Indonesian military was armed, trained, and financed by the United States right through the 17-year period until 1991. It was the first time the networks mentioned East Timor in all of this time. Even though the genocide in Timor was worse proportionally than Cambodia. But the difference was Pol Pot was an official enemy of the United States, so all the media would talk about it as they should. But in the case of Indonesia, Indonesia was a friend of Democratic and Republican presidents alike, from Ford to Reagan to Bush, from Ford to Carter to Reagan to Bush to Clinton, making deals with Suharto. That was 1991. 8 years later, the people of East Timor got to vote for their freedom. In 1999, in a UN-sponsored resolution. And now I'll come to the end. For 3 years, the United Nations ran East Timor as it transitioned. They voted for their freedom in 1999. And on May 20th, 2002, the people of East Timor became the newest nation in the world. We were able to get back into Timor for this celebration of independence. 100,000 people gathered outside of Dili in a place called Tasitolo, the surviving Timorese. Then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave a speech, world dignitaries gave speeches, and then Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of Timor who'd been imprisoned by the Indonesians for years, the founding president, got up, and he spoke in so many languages it would put us all to shame. And he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. And there was this fireworks display, and you could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the people of Timor. They had resisted, and they had won at an unbelievably, unacceptably high price. But they had won. A third of their population killed, 200,000 people. This nation of survivors had prevailed. And as they celebrated their victory, they thanked people, especially from the most powerful countries, for telling their governments to stop supplying weapons to the human rights abusing regimes of the world. And they have always been a lesson to us as a model of how to resist and to prevail. Whether we are doctors or nurses, professors, whether we're librarians, journalists, students, whether we're artists, employed or unemployed, we have a decision to make every day, every hour of every day. And that is whether we want to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy Now!
Let me end by thanking Melissa, Charlotte, and the committee that put this together. Amy and John for giving their time. And all of you for all you do. We look forward to working with you over the next year. Good night.